Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Mythic Mission with Professor Michael Jahosky. So I have been out for the last couple of weeks sick. I'm happy to be back recording in my home studio. And today for episode 15, which I'm entitling Chesterton and Tolkien on Imagination, Myth, and the Gospel, I have Joseph Pearce with me. I'm going to be posting in the episode details today his website where you can learn more about him, but I'd like to introduce you to him today. He's a native of England. Joseph Pearce is also an internationally acclaimed author of many books, which include bestsellers such as my personal favorite, Frodo's Journey, The Quest for Shakespeare, Tolkien, Man and Myth, C.S. Lewis and the Catholic Church, which I'm looking forward to reading, by the way, Wisdom and Innocence, A Life of G.K. Chesterton, and many others. His books have been published and translated into many languages. He has also hosted a two-part television series about Shakespeare on EWTN, and has also written and presented documentaries on EWTN on the Catholicism of the Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And he is also, in addition to all these things, a director of book publishing at the Augustine Institute, editor of the St. Austin Review, series editor of the Ignatius Critical Editions, senior instructor with Homeschool Connections, and senior contributor at the Imaginative Conservative. Thank you so much, Joseph, for coming on Mythic Mission today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I've been wanting to ask you about, because we've been corresponding over the last year, I think, off and on via email. I've been wanting to ask you about your journey to Christ and whether Tolkien or Lewis or Chesterton had anything to do with it. Would you mind just telling us your story for the first few minutes and how you became a Christian?
Yeah, so this will be the 3-minute version. I would say that I wrote a book called Race with the Devil, My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love. So if anybody is intrigued by this 3-minute version and they want to have the full book length version, so to speak, then that's where they can find it. Okay. But basically, as you said, I'm a native of England. I was born in London, in the East End of London. At the age of 15, I got involved in radical politics. I joined the neo-Nazi organization in England. Was full of hatred and bitterness, rose through the ranks of that organization, ended up editing 2 magazines for that organization, and became chairman of the youth movement, the Young National Front. And for the publication of the magazine, I was sentenced to prison twice for publishing material likely to incite racial hatred, so for hate crimes. I spent my 21st and my 25th birthdays in prison. And there was a big difference between the 2 prison sentences, because the first prison sentence, I was completely radical, considered myself to be a political prisoner and a prisoner of war. And I used my cell as a sort of a gym to get myself in shape physically, so I could come out and be a political soldier. But by the second prison sentence, I was thinking, what on earth am I doing here? I don't even believe this stuff anymore. I've been going through the motions. And the reason for the transformation was the fact that in the interim between those 2 prison sentences, I'd become enamored of the works of particularly G.K. Chesterton. And when I first read Chesterton, I had a very similar had a very similar impact upon me as when C.S. Lewis first read Chesterton. So for those of you that love Lewis, if you check out his book Surprised by Joy, when he mentions his first reading of Chesterton while he was in the army in World War I, he talks about the fact that Lewis was an atheist at the time. I was basically a racist, neo-Nazi, agnostic. But there's something about Chesterton. I think 2 things. First of all, the connection of faith and reason, that you don't have to choose between one or the other. You either choose faith and be irrational, and choose reason and therefore lack faith. They show the indissoluble union. Chesterton shows the indissoluble union of fides et ratio, of faith and reason. And that was crucial on Lewis's journey. It was also crucial on mine. And it was through Chesterton I was introduced to Lewis. And in actual fact, I plucked that book, Surprised by Joy, off of a used bookstore in London, opened it up at random, saw the reference to Chesterton. I thought, I've got to find out more about this fellow, C.S. Lewis. So I'd read a lot of Chesterton, a lot of Lewis. And then a conversation stopper. If I give talks on Tolkien, and one of the questions after my talk is, when did I first read The Lord of the Rings? The answer is during my second prison sentence, which if people don't know my past, it's that's a conversation stopper.
Sure.
I deferred reading The Lord of the Rings for so long because it's such a chunky volume, and I felt I should read it, but I'm too busy. And then you find yourself in prison with lots of time in your hands, is a perfect time to sit down and read The Lord of the Rings. So then I added Tolkien, of course, to Lewis and Chesterton as great friends who are holding my hand and leading me in the right direction. And then in 1989, when I was 28 years old, on St. Joseph's Day, 1989, I was received into the Catholic Church. So I'm a convert to Catholicism from agnosticism. So Protestants don't have to feel threatened by me. I haven't rejected something in which I've never believed. Basically, Chesterton led me into the church, and so I've just celebrated 32 years as a believing Christian, and I'm very, very grateful. And I always say that my first book upon becoming a Catholic was my biography of Chesterton, and I always say that was an act of thanksgiving. An act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton, but also an act of thanksgiving to Chesterton for giving me God.
Wow, that's beautiful. I had no idea about your background. Thank you for sharing that. So that definitely will prick up some ears and have people be interested to hear about your coming to Christ. And wasn't Chesterton, just you mentioned the funny aside about Protestantism? He was a high Anglican, right, before he became Catholic. Is that right?
Yes, he was high Anglican, and really he was a Catholic for many years before he formalized his relationship with the church, if you like. He deferred because his wife Frances was a very comfortable Anglican, and Chesterton didn't want to take such a decisive step without his wife coming with him. So he wrote Orthodoxy in 1908 and didn't become a Catholic until 1922. So it's 14 years afterwards. So that Chesterton was really a de facto Catholic before he became a de jure Catholic.
That makes sense. I had no idea it was so late into the, well, I mean, not late, but that late in 1922, you said, when he actually made the transition. But yeah, that distinction helps, that he was already practicing pretty much long before then. So I think in some ways I can relate. So more on that another time. So that's who we're here to talk about today. I mean, I've just got so many other questions about your background, but I want to hear particularly for our audience here at Mythic Mission, because your comment about the indissoluble union of faith and reason is so important. Having a rational apologetic, as we know, is very, very valuable. But I know from personal experience, I don't know if you can relate to this, but I've burned out so much on rational apologetics quite recently, the last maybe year and a half after finishing my book too, just coming down off of all that. I've realized how important it is in the telling of stories and appealing to the imagination. And I'm not saying that faith and imagination are the same thing, but I think that obviously the imagination plays a very, very significant role in having faith and staying in discipleship with Christ. So I'd like to hear, and we haven't done any episodes having anything to do with Chesterton. I want to talk about Tolkien and perhaps a little bit about Lewis, but I'm really interested to hear about, because clearly Chesterton was a great influence to you. Really, what should we read when it comes to Chesterton? Is there an order? I started with The Everlasting Man. I haven't read Orthodoxy. This is my first experience. What did Chesterton have to say about myth and the imagination? And kind of start there. And then I have some other questions for you.
If you'll permit me just to backtrack a little bit to the early part of your preamble to your question there.
Yes.
I agree with you completely that the rational apologetics, in other words, the apologetics of reason, is absolutely essential, and thanks be to God for it. And certainly if anybody tries to tell us that there's a path to Christ which is a path of irrationality, that's heresy. We need to turn our back on that. But the fact is that who we are as human beings made in the image of God that fall into two very broad categories: Homo viator, man on a journey, and anthropos, which according to Plato's definition of the word is he who looks up. So very briefly, take the latter first, anthropos. I sometimes say that the animal grazes, but man gazes. In other words, we are born in wonder, or we're meant to be born in wonder. We're meant to look up beyond the pure animal instincts that we have to something beyond physics to metaphysics. We look at the stars and yes, look at them and wonder, and then look at them and measure them and take that scientific approach. We're also meant to write sonnets about them and just to have our hearts lifted by them. So anthropos, but Homo viator means man on the journey. Now, if man's on a journey, if each of us is on a journey, each of us is in our own life journey, which is a life story, which is why that Christ himself teaches us the most powerful lessons through the power of story. First of all, his own life story, right? The greatest story ever told is the life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ. But also within that story, he tells us other stories, parables, the prodigal son. And the prodigal son never existed. He's a figment of our Lord's imagination. It's a work of fiction. And yet the prodigal son, of course, is very real. We see ourselves as the prodigal son to such a degree that he's the archetype and we're types. In other words, the fictional character is more real in some sense than we are. So our Lord shows us that way. And then the other aspect of who we are is homo superbus, proud man, who refuses the journey, who wants to do his own thing and wander off and lose sight of the goal. And so it's that battle in every human heart and every human soul and every human mind between the homo viator we're called to be and the homo superbus we're tempted to be. That is the struggle which all of us face. So that's the backdrop to it all. Now, to answer your question, probably the best place to start with Chesterton's approach to evangelizing through the power of the imagination or the power of beauty is the orthodoxy, and particularly there's a chapter in orthodoxy called the Ethics of Elfland, and that particular chapter was very influential on both Tolkien and Lewis in their own development to this apologetics through the power of beauty, through the power of the imagination.
Yeah, I've come across that's a beautiful answer. Thank you. And the idea of, I want to come back to homo viator in particular. And I was just thinking of so many things that Tolkien has said on fairy stories. So before I get back to that, I'd like to point out that it's been something I've come across several times in my reading, how influential. I've heard about this Elfland chapter in Orthodoxy, but I've never read Chesterton. So I know that this is something Tolkien was influenced by, and Lewis as well, I imagine. I'm not sure who came to it first, but I'd like to start exploring that connection. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that later on. But I think maybe a general response I'd give right now is how important it is to understand that there is a narrative quality to life, and that we're all, man on a journey. And so I think that the best way, perhaps I would say best, now I feel this more than ever, to come to the truth of Jesus is through some sort of narrative form, to understand how to embody the Christian story, to walk with Christ. And really, that's the best way to learn about anybody, is to step inside their vision of the world. And so we need to find a way to appeal to the imagination, and not least because we're not just rational minds. We're incarnational beings. We have a heart and a soul and a mind and a body, and we need to appeal to the whole person. So I think this is a very, very beneficial way to approach things. And you said homo superbus is the prideful man, right? That resists. Yeah, where does that come from? Is that, you mentioned Plato, but I know that that's obviously not Plato.
No, the word anthropos is, of course, the Greek word for man.
Yes.
And although etymologists argue about what anthropos means, Plato says that anthropos means that he who turns upwards. And Plato's definition is certainly good enough for me. So that's the reason for that. No, the homo superbus is basically, I don't know. I mean, I use the term. I'm not saying I'm the first person to use it. I'm sure I'm not, but I don't think I got it from somebody else. It's just, it means proud man. And obviously proud man, the sin of pride is the father of all the other sins. That's why it's at the bottom of Dante's Inferno, and also the bottom of Mount Purgatorio, because it's the furthest from heaven. Because it's pride that gives us permission to commit the other 6 deadly sins. Because pride is making ourselves God. So pride is refusing the journey. So pride is the enemy of homo viator, who we're made to be and called to be. We're meant to follow in the footsteps of Christ, which means taking up our cross, which means asking him to help us carry it, and through the embrace of suffering, coming to the fullness of redemption, because it's only through the cross, our own cross as well as Christ's, that we come to the resurrection.
Certainly. Yeah, that's quite illuminating. Thank you. So now to move on to, I think the next question I have, just to start exploring this ethics of Elfland. If you can tell us a little bit about Chesterton's understanding of myth and perhaps what Tolkien called fairy, as I imagine this has something to do with Elfland, this idea of a fantasy in the imagination, and what uses of it do we have as disciples, and how can we use it in our own Christian walk, and then perhaps more importantly, how can we use it to bring others to faith in Jesus? And what did
Yeah,
Chesterton have to say?
so obviously you know that in the older understanding of the word fairy, the way that Tolkien uses it, is actually synonymous with the word elf,
Mm.
which is why you know that we in the Lord of the Rings we have elves who in the broader scheme of things are fairies. So that's another word for it. So when Chesterton uses in the Ethics of Elfland, Elfland is synonymous with a fairy story. But what Chesterton says is that what fairy stories show us is not the way things are, but the way they should be. All right, and the way things ought to be, and you actually see this taken up by Tolkien in his essay and lecture on fairy stories, and certainly those that you can see the influence of Chesterton's Ethics of Elfland in Tolkien's lecture on fairy stories. In actual fact, it'd be a great paper, great article for someone to write to actually compare the two. But the key thing is, of course, it is showing the way things should be unrealistic. You know, is it escape from reality? And the way that I think Chesterton would say it, he does say it in that chapter, but maybe not specifically like this. Christ shows us what it is to be perfectly human. And we're all called to be like Christ. Now, of course, are any of us going to succeed in being the 100% perfect human person that Jesus Christ is? No, we're not. But is becoming more like that 100% perfect Christ becoming more real, more fully human? Yes, it is. To be fully human is to be fully Christ-like. So therefore, aspiring to, first of all, being inspired by, so that we can then be aspired towards that perfection, is what allows us to grow in virtue and allows us thereby to actually tap into a deeper understanding of reality. And that's essentially what Chesterton's saying in that chapter, The Ethics of Elfland, is we need to be given visions of the perfection that transcends and supersedes the brokenness and fallenness of the world, in order to actually grow into better people who are ipso facto closer to reality.
I cannot believe I've not stumbled across this before. I'm so happy you brought this up. And you know, I was just as you were getting ready to say it, that fairy is as reality ought to be. I was thinking of the introduction of my book. This is what I spend a lot of time unpacking. It's so important, I think, for people listening, especially to our show, that we wrap our mind around this idea of myth and this higher level of understanding of metaphysics that can show us that things in a myth are more real in many ways than the green grass under our feet. And I'm reminded of a passage out of The Two Towers. You probably remember when Tolkien tells the story of Aragorn meeting Éomer for the first time, the very beginning of the book, and he exclaims that he's never heard of halflings and it's something out of legend. And Aragorn makes a comment about the green grass under our feet being something like a mighty matter of legend and myth. And I think this is very important. A lot of people I've spoken to think this is us saying that, you know, well, myth is more real than science. And that's not what we're saying. Is that there are many ways of understanding truth about the reality that we find ourselves in. And that myth, as you said, shows us, and as Chesterton said, shows us reality as it ought to be, a glimpse of that heavenly landscape that we're meant to be one day living in when we accept Christ. And so I think this is so important to grasp, and I think a lot of people struggle with the epistemology question about, you know, we think science is always a gateway to an understanding of what's more real, but that's quite the opposite of what Chesterton and Tolkien are saying. And so I think this is a very key point.
I mean, the point is that the science. First of all, let's define our terms here,
please,
because the modern word science is not what the medievals understood the word science to mean. The word science comes from the Latin word scientia, which just means knowledge, which means before the Enlightenment, which led to the philosophy of materialism, which basically there's no reality beyond matter. That's what materialism is. That at that point, science knowledge, the only legitimate knowledge was knowledge of physics.
Sure.
But going right back to Aristotle, of course, there's a distinction between physics and metaphysics. For the medievals, theology was the queen of the sciences. You know, philosophy is a science, history is a science, even literature is a science, because in that broader, and I think better understanding the word science, ciencia, knowledge, all of these are paths to knowledge. And as regards reality, there is obviously more to reality than that which can be quantified. And all that the physical sciences can do is to look at that which is physical. They can have nothing to say on what is goodness, what is beauty, what is truth. I mean, there's a difference between a fact, that which is physically demonstrable, and a truth. Does pride precede a fall? Well, evidently it does. But what can the physical sciences prove about that empirically? Nothing. So clearly the physical sciences have a limited, blinkered, I think you say blinded in this country, vision of reality. And it's absolutely true. And that science is good, and it's a path to knowledge. But it's only a path to only a part of knowledge, not all of knowledge. And if when we start to believe that the part is the whole, we've gone astray.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a fallacy too. I think it's the compositional fallacy, and modern man has bought into it. We think this is the only way to understand the world. But as you said, there are many paths of knowledge to understand reality. But knowledge is always about something. So all of these branches of science, you might say, are targeted at understanding reality better. And then there's something to say about the fact that there's no empirical proof for empiricism, is that it can't live up to its own standards. And so there's that circular problem as well. So I think what we're really trying to do here is to help people understand how to think about the world more broadly. And as I know Alistair McGrath has worded it in a way that is very beautiful, to have a more capacious understanding, a wider understanding of the world. And I think Chesterton, Tolkien, and Lewis can help us do that. And I know in the age now we're living in, we're revising people from the past. Dr. Seuss, you've probably heard about the fiasco with that. And I start to wonder what cancel culture is going to say about these three pretty soon. And I'm hoping that doesn't happen. But anyway, I'm going adrift now. Let's bring it back to Chesterton. I'm glad we stopped to define our terms there. And I want to ask you, did Chesterton ever give a definition or understanding of myth? Is that synonymous with Elfland, or did he write about it in any place?
Well, you could say in some sense that everything he wrote is connected to what I usually call this in reference to Tolkien, a philosophy of myth. Okay. In other words, again, breaking that phrase up, myth is not the modern sense of the word. Myth is a lie, something which is not true. Now, the older sense of the word, a myth is a story, right? So a story can be a lie, but it can also be the truth, like the story of the prodigal son, for instance. So this philosophy of myth, philosophia, the love of wisdom, to be found in story. Okay, and really everything that Chesterton writes, in some sense or other, is informed by that philosophia of myth, the love of wisdom to be found from stories. So it's really much more difficult to try to disentangle Chesterton. Is there anything he wrote that somehow is not informed by that understanding? No. So in other words, you can read the Ethics of Elfland in Orthodoxy and get an understanding of his approach to everything he talks about.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. So that's for our listeners, pick up Orthodoxy, and I would like to ask you about the Everlasting Man as well, if that's the next work we should take a look at. But look at Ethics of Elfland. It's a chapter in Orthodoxy for Chesterton's philosophy of myth, and I think that is a very good phrase to understand what Chesterton and Tolkien and Lewis were doing. So talk about the Everlasting Man too. What was he trying to do in that book, that Chesterton wrote? I think it was after Orthodoxy. Again, I'm a blank slate here. Then we'll move on to, if we could, how Chesterton, if you could speak to maybe some specifics, how he did influence Tolkien and Lewis, and then we can see where we end up from there.
Okay. Well, the first thing then is that the to the background to the writing of the Everlasting Man. So the Everlasting Man was published, I think, in 1925. Could have been 1926, but I think it was 1925. So, 17 or 18 years after Orthodoxy and after Chesterton's reception to the church. And what it was a response and a riposte to H.G. Wells. So H.G. Wells wrote a book called The Outline of History, which was an international bestseller. And basically, it was a materialistic understanding of history, where history is a progress towards a golden age in the future, which will be ushered in by the triumph of science over superstition. So very much a materialistic and what C.S. Lewis would call a chronological, snobbish approach to understanding history. The past is always inferior to the present, and the present will always be inferior to the future. So this progressive understanding of history. Now, that was published. It had a profound influence in leading people away from the faith. For instance, Joy Davidman, when she was a very young girl, I think about 12 or 13, read The Outline of Sanity and instantaneously became an atheist. And obviously, thanks to the works of C.S. Lewis, eventually came to Christianity. But Chesterton's great friend Hilaire Belloc wrote a riposte to H.G. Wells called A Companion to H.G. Wells's Outline of History, where he basically said that Wells doesn't know history and doesn't know what he's talking about. His philosophy is wrong, but not just his philosophy, his just grasp of the facts also is inadequate. So H.G. Wells responded with a book called Mr. Belloc Objects. And then Belloc responded to that with another book called Mr. Belloc Still Objects. So this had gone back and forth for about 5 years. Belloc claimed to have written over 100,000 words in refutation of Wells's Outline of History, but it was became somewhat bad-tempered. The two men clearly didn't like each other. So what The Everlasting Man is Chesterton's response to respond to H.G. Wells's vision of history, but with charity, without any sense of belligerence against Wells. And one of the remarkable things about Chesterton, and one of the things which shows his sanctity, is that he spent his whole life arguing with people and never quarreled. So one of my favorite statements of Chesterton is from his autobiography, when he's speaking about his relationship with his brother, his younger brother, who was killed in World War I. He said, "We were always arguing, but we never quarreled." So the whole lot, and this is what you mentioned about the cancel culture, right? This is the response of a radical relativism that doesn't know the difference between an argument and a quarrel, right? If you disagree with someone, cancel them. You destroy them. You don't engage with them and try to persuade them to your perspective. So Chesterton basically took this very charitable approach, and he wrote The Everlasting Man, and should we say what's the thesis of it is that the incarnation is at the center of history and makes sense of history. That all of history prior to the incarnation is moving towards the incarnation and pointing towards the incarnation. So the Jews, if you like, were being ripened in their understanding of God, in their covenant to be awaiting the Messiah. But the Greeks were, through their telling of stories, and also through their looking at anthropos in philosophy and the love of wisdom. So in other words, in Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, in Homer and Sophocles and Aeschylus, the Greeks are being ripened, the Gentiles, the pagans, for the coming of Christ. So the moment in history when Christ becomes incarnate is a moment when both the Gentiles and the Jews, if you like, are moving towards this point of congruence, and then the incarnation makes sense of history, and then the whole of history since then basically also looks back to the incarnation, because the incarnation is what makes sense of time and man's place in it. So that's essentially what The Everlasting Man is. It's a Christocentric history of the world.
This is why I'm enjoying it thoroughly already. I think I'm only just about 20, 30 pages in, so I've got quite a long way to go. But I'm reminded, thank you for that explanation. I'm reminded of Myth Became Fact by Lewis. And his argument, I mean, in other places, of course, that he wrote about the incarnation in Miracles, for instance, but I'm reminded of this, and I'm just going to share this with you because when I was writing my book too, I had so many people I was talking to, students not least, who had a problem with this explanation that Chesterton and Lewis and Tolkien in his own way present. This idea is the incarnation is the keystone of history, as the hinge. What is Lewis, I think in the review of Lord of the Rings or somewhere, says something that it's a great myth, and I think he was thinking of Christianity is a master key. And I've got so many people objecting to this, and here's what I often get. I just wonder if you could speak to this, and then we can get into our final subject on the Chesterton Tolkien connection. But they say, why does it have to be Christianity? Why must you say that we have to look back at the Greek myths and the Jewish? Just leave the Judaism alone, leave it out of that, and everything is pointing to Christianity. Why can't it be pointing to Islam? Why not Buddhism? Why does it? It seems like such a confirmational bias that we're guilty of as Christians. And, of course, it's our own revisionist history. I've been told that we're just looking at the whole of history in a self-centered way, all pointing to Jesus. And I guess it's that question, why not pointing to some other story? Why does it have to be the Christian story? I wonder how Chesterton would respond to that today, because we hear a lot of that.
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is that as regard Lewis's conversion to Christianity, he says in Surprised by Joy that reading The Everlasting Man for the first time allowed him to see the Christian outline of history in a way that made sense. So clearly, reading Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man, was crucial on Lewis's own conversion. Now, as regards whether Christ is at the center of history, also is not just at the center of history, he's at the source of history and at its climax. So let's not even beat about the bush here. The point is, as Chesterton and Tolkien and Lewis and numerous people throughout the history of humanity have shown, and this is something we should, I request that our students speak from a position of knowledge and not ignorance, certainly not the arrogance of ignorance. So look at the extent to which St. Augustine engages with Plato. Look at the way that St. Thomas Aquinas engages with Aristotle. Look at the way that Christianity has not asked us to choose between a rational path to reality and a fideist path to reality. It insists actually on an incarnational aspect, whereas that both faith and reason are indissolubly married. In other words, the Catholic Church, as Chesterton says, is the one continuous institution that's been thinking about thinking for 2,000 years. Now, if an institution has been thinking about thinking for 2,000 years, perhaps you should listen to it before passing judgment upon it. And that, of course, takes work. It also takes humility. Know that you have to take time, but certainly don't feel that you can dismiss 2,000 years of rational engagement with reality through all sorts of fashions, of philosophical and political fashions, most of which have been inimical to Christianity. In other words, as Christ says, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you. To be a Christian has never been easy in any generation. So again, the whole idea that in the past the world was dominated by Christians, and the sins of the past are the fault of Christians. No, the sins of the past are the fault of people refusing to live as Christians. Right? If you look at political history, it's pride usurping humility. In other words, people turn their back on Christ. Now, as Chesterton said, that history has not been tried, so Christianity has not been tried and found wanting. It's been wanting and left untried. And that's the problem, is that that very few people actually really try to live what Christ teaches and tells us to live. Now, the other thing is, you have to understand that the primal reality is not physical, but metaphysical. And you start from, and it is a construct, by the way, there's nothing wrong with constructing an understanding of reality. We construct a house so we don't die of the cold. We construct clothes so that we can wear for whatever reasons we need to wear clothes. That we don't live in a primeval suit, thanks be to God, because we construct from our knowledge of reality a better understanding of it. So what you find basically in Christianity is an engagement with the truth and a construction of an understanding of reality, which stands up to all contrary understandings. That's the test. Let's try. And that's what Chesterton does in Orthodoxy, particularly. He looks at all the other, and Belloc, by the way, in a great book called, two great books, one called Survivals and New Arrivals. And he talks about the various different approaches that are anti-Christian throughout history for the last 2,000 years, and shows that the Christianity stands the test of time, whereas the others don't, because it's true.
Sure. That's so powerful. And I think there's a problem in our modern culture. I joke with my students all the time about this. I say, how many of you have a favorite book? And there's blank stares. Okay, are we reading? Oh, no, we're watching YouTube videos all the time. And I'm fine with that. There's so many ways to get information today, and that's all good. We're doing one here, and that's great. But the problem today is we're lacking that thirst for critical thinking. We're lacking humility. Cancel culture and just being wokeism in general is just such a exhausting, depleting way of looking at the world, I think. And problematically, it prevents people from curing their ignorance and actually taking the time to look at their objections and see if has anybody responded to these. And I think the one that I got you started on answering, this idea, why does it have to be the Christian story, is could be so easily addressed if people bothered to really take the time to look at their objections. And I fear that a lot of people just don't want to because they might be afraid of what they'll find. Or it's easier to just be hateful. It's easier to be skeptical. It's easier to be, how did somebody just put it recently, to always find some sort of oppression or, some problem with something, to be cynical. And I think that's a large problem. But then I think also what you said about, this construction of reality, that's what a myth does. It's a way of understanding it. And so what we must do is compare the different narratives and see which one stands the test of truth and makes sense of the world we're living in.
Yeah,
And unless you've done that.
To use a very fundamental fairy story, let's have a look at the various constructions that make sense of reality and find out whether they're made of straw or twigs or bricks, as in the story of the three pigs, right? Let's try to blow them down, right? If we and those that are built upon a fallacy will be blown down. Those that are built upon a rock will not be blown down. And that's the test. And but in order to do that, you have to have an objective engagement with that which is beyond yourself. And the problem is with relativism is it deifies the self. It basically says that you are your own God and you can construct your own cosmos. And also, it's not about reality because you make your own reality up. It's about feelings. Right? Now, if something is based upon what I feel, right, then there's no engagement with the real any longer, right? Because it's all about your emotions, your pride, your prejudice, your favorites, and nobody can tell you otherwise because you're the god of your cosmos, right? Sure. Now, if that's your level of engagement, there is no level of engagement because you're refusing to engage with that bigger world of which you are part, and which you will never come to know unless you are humble enough to actually look for it.
I quite agree, and I think this is going to be really helpful for our listeners to inspire you to help get a deeper way of looking at reality. Let's turn to the myths. Let's turn to the way of looking at the world through imagination that can help us engage reality even more broadly. And we need that now more than ever. We can't just look at things rationally, but we have to look that people have hearts. And I think that's one thing some evangelists might be missing today is that, cancel culture and woke culture is such a movement of passion and emotions that we have to remember to appeal to that, and that these are imagers of God as well. And we have to find a way to dig underneath those foundations without becoming without becoming relativists and also just thinking that it's, a head problem, because it's not. It's also a matter of the heart. So this is, I hope, going to be a great inspiration to people listening to this today. And just the final few minutes, Joseph, and I just have so many things to thank you for sharing with us today that have been beautiful. Any connection, because of course, my research does deal a lot with Tolkien. Anything you'd like to leave us with? Any final thoughts about the connection between Chesterton and Tolkien that that we haven't already touched on? And then I just want to ask you about anything that you're involved in nowadays. Any projects, any publications coming up as we tie things up.
Sure. So first of all, that we know that Chesterton was a significant influence on the young Tolkien. This should not be a surprise. I mean, Tolkien's father died when he was very young, but Tolkien's mother was received into the Catholic Church in 1900, and she died just a few years later. But Tolkien adhered to the faith that the Catholic faith throughout his life. Now, as a young man, he's born in 1892. Chesterton's Chesterton's influence upon Catholic culture in England, in English-speaking world, was probably at its peak in many ways prior to World War I. So, in other words, when Tolkien was a teenager. And we know that he read and greatly admired as a young man. He became more skeptical when he was older. The Ballad of the White Horse, for instance, by Chesterton. We know that he was widely read in Chesterton's works. We know that there were many of Chesterton's works in Tolkien's private library. And we can certainly find Chesterton's influence in Tolkien's philosophy of myth. And I sometimes, this is the way I would actually talk about Chesterton's importance to Tolkien in the broadest sense, which is maybe what we have time for at the moment. That Tolkien said of his relationship with Lewis, that Lewis was not an influence in the way that word is usually understood. He was a great encourager. And Tolkien said if it wasn't for Lewis's encouragement, he would not have finished The Lord of the Rings. We also know that as a consequence of the long night talk between Tolkien and Lewis and Hugo Dyson in September 1931, there was Tolkien's elucidation of the philosophy of myth that Tolkien himself would have got largely, not exclusively, obviously, from Chesterton, that Lewis became a Christian, a believing Christian. Without that conversation, he may well never have become a Christian. Without the philosophy of myth, he would never become a Christian. And we know of Chesterton's influence directly on Lewis's also progress to Christianity. So I would say, first of all, that if it wasn't for C.S. Lewis, we would not have The Lord of the Rings. If it wasn't for J.R.R. Tolkien, we wouldn't have the Chronicles of Narnia. And if it wasn't for G.K. Chesterton, we might not have had either. And that, I think, is the best way of talking about Chesterton's influence on the philosophy of myth of those two great writers.
Yes, that's quite beautiful and right on the nose, I think, of what I wanted to ask you about as far as the connection between the three men. And what I think is going to be new for our audience is hearing Chesterton's influence behind behind Tolkien in that conversation in 1931. That's a connection I didn't discern that Tolkien was reaching back to those insights from Chesterton to help shape Lewis's thinking and bring him from theism to full belief in Christ again, which is brilliant. So as we close, and again, I wish I had been taking notes. That's why I'm going to be able to listen to this again and take some notes of my own. I scrambled to try to get a couple, some of the references you mentioned, but please tell us, what are you working on these days? Do you have any talks coming up? Anything you'd like us to know about that I can share with our listeners?
Well, I mean, I've just finished writing a history of England. It's the title of it, at least the title I've given to it, unless the publisher changes it, is the what is it? What did I the Faith of Our Fathers, a history of true England. So it looks basically at the presence of Catholic Christianity from the first century. Starts with a chapter called A Christ Haunted Country, with all the legends about the behind the Holy Grail and whether or not the Christ child visited England. Maybe wishful thinking, of course, but the point is that that has inspired, nonetheless, the stories of the Holy Grail. But St. Joseph of Arimathea might have brought the chalice that was used at the Last Supper to England. And even if that's not true, that, if you like, has caused England to be haunted by the presence of Christ. the whole Arthurian thing, but also just the factual history and then the 300 years of persecution of the church and the hundreds of martyrs who were put to death for their practice of the faith between the 1530s and the 1680s. Right through to the Catholic revival, Newman, Chesterton, Tolkien, in the 20th century, and so that's what I've just finished writing. The next book I'm contracted to write is a book I've called, and it actually dovetails with our discussion here. Book I've called The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful: A History in Three Dimensions. And basically, it's going to be one chapter for each of the 20 centuries, from the time of Christ to the 20th century. And it's going to look at the three threads that weave the tapestry of the human story: Homo viator, the good. In other words, that witness which we see from those who have either that are saints, that have lived the good life and been witnesses to Christ. The bad, those Homo superbus, so Homo viator. And then Homo superbus, the bad, the wicked, and their influence upon history. And then the beautiful, so the great works of art. Pope Benedict XVI said, in the final analysis, the greatest argument for the church is not the rational arguments, but the saints that she's inspired and the great works of art that have poured forth from her womb. So I'm going to be looking at the great work of architecture, visual arts, literature, music. So the good, the bad, and the beautiful: history in three dimensions. That's the next book on which I'm going to be working.
Okay, I know I personally want to get both of those. Is the History of England out yet, or was it?
No, I only delivered it about a month ago, and it's Ignatius Press, and they are slow and deliberative in the production process. It's likely to be early next year before it actually sees the light of day.
Okay, well, when it does,
this wasn't a good marketing exercise, because people can't even go and buy what I'm promoting. But there you go.
Shucks. No, it's good. It'll be on the airways though, and rest assured, when it does hit the press, I'll be one of the first customers. That sounds splendid, and I love the Holy Grail setting that you've given in that first chapter. I can't wait to read it. I don't own a good book on English history, so that'll be my first.
The thing, there isn't really a good one-volume history of England, so that's one of the reasons I chose to write it. It's going to be hopefully a trailblazer, and will allow people just to own one book, read, and at least have their a skeleton sketch of English history.
Yeah, and I know my students, we were just going over Anglo-Saxon England recently, and they loved I didn't know, William the Conqueror brought the French, that they were fascinated just with the whole interaction and how many peoples came in and out of England. So I know that'll be fascinating read. Okay, well, as far as other details, I'm going to be posting your website on the episode description. So thank you all for listening. And most of all, Joseph, thank you so much for your time today. This was great.
It's been a pleasure, and keep up the great work you're doing, and may it bear great fruit.
Thank you.